Hello, fellow explorer. I'm glad you found your way here. Welcome to Midnight Explorations, a quiet place for gentle journeys and deep rest. Tonight, we travel along paths worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, hoofbeats, and the slow turning of caravan wheels. These are stories of connection rather than conquest, of patience rather than haste, of the countless ordinary journeys that wove the world together long before the age of engines and wires. For the next little while, there is nothing for you to do and nowhere for you to go. Let the day fade into the distance and focus on getting comfortable and breathing deeply. There is no urgency here, only the soft rhythm of a camel's footfall on sand, the creak of leather harnesses, the murmur of voices in languages long forgotten. Let these stories carry you across deserts and mountains, through oasis towns and ancient cities, along routes that still trace their faint lines across the maps of our modern world. Close your eyes now and let go. The Silk Roads were never a single road. There was no highway stretching unbroken from the markets of Chang'an to the harbours of the Mediterranean, no route that a traveller could follow from beginning to end without pause or detour. Instead, there were networks, overlapping, shifting, branching paths that connected East Asia to Central Asia, South Asia to the Iranian plateau, the steppes of the north to the Indian Ocean shores of the south. These routes grew slowly over centuries, through countless short journeys made by merchants who rarely travelled more than a few hundred miles before passing their goods to other hands. A bolt of silk might change owners a dozen times between the looms of China and the markets of Rome, each exchange adding distance and story to its journey. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Silk Roads. They were not built for speed or spectacle. They were built for patience. Movement along these routes was measured not in miles per hour, but in days between wells, in weeks between oasis towns, in seasons between mountain passes that opened only when the snows melted and closed again when the first storms of autumn arrived. A caravan might take a year or more to complete a journey that a modern aircraft could cover in hours. And most merchants never made such journeys at all. They traded within familiar regions, knowing the terrain and the people, the reliable water sources and the dangerous stretches, leaving the longer distances to the accumulated effort of many hands. The very name Silk Roads is a modern invention, coined by a German geographer in the 19th century to describe networks that had no single name in their own time. The merchants who travelled these routes did not think of themselves as traversing a unified system. They thought of themselves as making particular journeys between particular places, from Kashgar to Samarkand, from Dunhuang to Turfan, from one oasis to the next. The grand narrative of East meeting West was constructed later, by historians looking back at patterns that participants experienced as local, immediate, practical. This is not to diminish the significance of what the Silk Roads achieved, but to understand it properly, as the accumulation of countless small actions, rather than the execution of any grand plan. The goods that moved along these routes were equally varied. Silk gave the roads their name in modern imagination. But silk was only one thread in a much larger tapestry of exchange. Salt and grain travelled alongside precious metals. Woolen blankets from the steppes moved eastward, while cotton fabrics moved westward. Horses bred in the valleys of Central Asia were prized by Chinese emperors. Jade carved in the mountains of Khotan adorned the courts of the Yellow River Plain. Spices, glassware, paper, medicines, and incense all found their way along these paths, carried by animals and people who knew nothing of the distant origins or final destinations of their cargo. And alongside the goods travelled ideas, Buddhism spread from India to China along the same routes that carried silk and horses. Mathematical knowledge moved from Greece to Persia, to Central Asia and onward. Techniques for making paper, for casting metal, for weaving particular patterns into cloth, all of these crossed the mountains and deserts, carried not in crates, but in the minds of craftsmen, monks and scholars who settled in new cities and taught what they knew to new students. The Silk Roads were as much highways of thought as highways of commerce, and the exchange they fostered shaped civilizations on every continent they touched. To understand why the Silk Roads took the forms they did, you must first understand the land itself. Geography was the silent architect of these routes, shaping where people could travel and where they could not, creating corridors of movement through terrain that would otherwise have been impassable. The heart of the Silk Road system lay in Central Asia, a vast region of deserts, mountains and grasslands stretching from the borders of China to the Caspian Sea. This was not hospitable country. The Taklamakan Desert, whose name is sometimes translated as the place of no return, occupied the center of the Tarim Basin, a sea of shifting dunes where summer temperatures could exceed 40 degrees Celsius and where water was so scarce that travelers who strayed from the known paths might die of thirst within days. No one crossed the Taklamakan directly. Instead, routes skirted its edges, following the northern and southern rims of the basin where rivers flowing down from the surrounding mountains created oases, green islands of life in a landscape of sand and stone. The northern route passed through towns like Turfan and Kucha, following a chain of oases along the base of the Tian Shan Mountains. Turfan, one of the lowest points in Central Asia, below sea level, like the Dead Sea, was famous for its grapes and its heat. The oasis survived on water channeled through underground tunnels called carrés, which brought snowmelt from the mountains without losing it to evaporation. Kucha was a larger center, known for its Buddhist monasteries and for the musicians who developed distinctive traditions that influenced Chinese court music for centuries. Each oasis had its own character, its own economy, its own relationship to the trade that passed through. The southern route ran through Khotan and Nia, hugging the foothills of the Kunlun Range. Khotan was famous above all for its jade. White jade and green jade carried eastward to China for thousands of years before silk ever traveled in the opposite direction. The workshops of Khotan produced carved objects of extraordinary beauty, prized by Chinese emperors and nobles who believed the stone had spiritual properties. Nia, further along the southern route, was a smaller oasis that eventually dried up entirely, its ruins preserved by the desert sands and rediscovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. A time capsule of Silk Road life, frozen at the moment of abandonment. Both routes converged at Kashgar, at the western edge of the basin, where the desert gave way to the towering peaks of the Pamir Mountains. From Kashgar, travelers faced a choice: climb into the Pamirs toward the Fergana Valley and the grasslands beyond, or turn southward toward Bactria and the passes leading into Afghanistan and northwestern India. Each path had its dangers. The Pamirs were called the roof of the world, their passes choked with snow for much of the year, their altitudes high enough to sicken those unaccustomed to thin air. The southern routes crossed territories contested by shifting powers, where safety depended on the favor of local rulers and the protection of armed escorts. East of the Tarim Basin, the Hexi Corridor provided the crucial link between the Chinese interior and the western regions. This narrow strip of land, squeezed between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, was the only practical route from the fertile plains of China to the oases of Central Asia. Whoever controlled the Hexi corridor controlled access to the Silk Roads, and Chinese dynasties fortified it accordingly, building walls and watchtowers and garrison towns to protect the flow of goods and diplomats. At the western end of the corridor lay Dunhuang, a threshold town marking the transition from the familiar world of China to the long chain of oases stretching toward the setting sun. Climate shaped these routes as much as terrain. The high passes of the Pamirs and Tian Shan were open only in summer, when the snows melted enough to allow passage, typically from June to September, though the exact timing varied with each year's weather. The deserts were most dangerous in midsummer, when heat and lack of water could kill both animals and men within hours of leaving a reliable source. Sandstorms could bury a caravan in hours, the fine particles working into every crevice of clothing and equipment, choking animals and blinding travelers who had no shelter. Flash floods in the mountains could turn dry riverbeds into torrents without warning, sweeping away people and goods that had camped in what seemed like safe locations. Travelers learned to read the signs, the clouds building over distant peaks, the color of the sky at dawn, the behavior of local animals that warned of dangers ahead. The challenges were not limited to dramatic disasters. Salt flats crusted the ground in many areas, their sharp crystals cutting the feet of animals and people alike. Riverless stretches forced caravans to carry all their water, adding weight that slowed progress and required careful calculation of distances and reserves. High passes brought altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, breathlessness that could incapacitate travelers unaccustomed to thin air. Extreme cold in the mountains and on the steppes during winter could freeze water skins solid and kill animals that lacked adequate shelter. Each season brought its own hazards, and experienced travelers planned their journeys to minimize exposure to the worst of them. Travelers learned to time their journeys to the rhythms of the seasons, departing in spring to cross the deserts before the worst of the summer heat, waiting in oasis towns for the mountain passes to clear, adjusting their routes year by year as rivers shifted course and political circumstances changed. The existence of multiple parallel routes was not a sign of confusion, but of adaptation. When one path became dangerous, whether from banditry, political instability, or natural disaster, merchants could shift to another. When river courses changed, as they often did in the arid lands of Central Asia, new oases grew and old ones withered, and the routes shifted with them. The Silk Roads were never fixed. They were living systems, responding to the land and the people who traveled through it, evolving over centuries in ways that no single map could capture. Long before any empire gave these routes a name, people were moving across them. The Silk Roads did not spring into existence with any single event or policy. They emerged gradually from paths that farmers, herders, and miners had used for millennia. Steppe pastoralists drove their flocks across grasslands that stretched from the borders of China to the plains of Hungary, following seasonal patterns of grazing that their ancestors had established in the distant past. Traders carried jade from the mountains of Central Asia to the courts of early Chinese states, establishing networks of exchange that would later carry silk in the opposite direction. Migrants followed river valleys through the mountains, settling in oases where water made farming possible, creating the towns that would one day host caravanserais and markets. These early movements were not commerce in any formal sense. They were the gradual accumulation of familiarity, the slow process by which people in one region came to know what people in another region had, what they wanted, and how exchanges might benefit both. A herder who knew the mountain passes might guide a merchant through them in exchange for grain or metal tools. A village that produced fine wool might trade it to neighbors who produced pottery, and those neighbors might trade the wool onward to others who had never seen the original sheep. Over generations, these chains of exchange grew longer and more complex, reaching across distances that no individual traveler could cross alone. The pastoral nomads of the steppe were crucial intermediaries in this process. They were not stationary people. Their lives were defined by movement, following their herds across grasslands that could not support permanent agriculture. This mobility gave them knowledge that settled peoples lacked. Knowledge of water sources across vast distances, of seasonal paths through terrain that seemed featureless to outsiders, of the customs and languages of communities scattered across thousands of miles. They could serve as guides, as guards, as carriers of goods and messages. They could also be raiders, threatening the caravans they might otherwise have protected. And this dual role made relations between nomads and settled peoples a constant negotiation, a balance of cooperation and wariness that shaped the character of Silk Road travel for centuries. The animals themselves were crucial to this early exchange. Horses, in particular, were highly valued across the connected regions. The horses of Central Asia, bred in the grasslands of the Fergana Valley and the steppes beyond, were larger, faster, and stronger than the ponies that Chinese farmers raised. They could carry warriors into battle, pull chariots and carts, cover distances that would exhaust lesser animals. Chinese states prized these horses for their armies, and this demand created powerful incentives for contact with the peoples of the West. Tales of heavenly horses that sweated blood circulated at Chinese courts, mixing reality with legend, but the underlying truth was clear. The horses of the West were worth pursuing, worth trading for, worth sending envoys across deserts and mountains to obtain. Horses were among the most valuable goods that moved along these early routes. The horses of Central Asia, bred in the grasslands of the Fergana Valley and the steppes beyond, were larger, faster, and stronger than the ponies that Chinese farmers raised. Chinese states prized them for their armies, and this demand created incentives for contact with the peoples of the West. Jade moved in the opposite direction, carried from the mountains of Khotan to the workshops of China, where craftsmen carved it into objects of ritual and beauty. Textiles moved in multiple directions. Chinese silks, Central Asian woolens, and later cotton fabrics from India, each adapted to the climates and tastes of the regions that produced and consumed them. These exchanges were not dramatic events. They were the slow accumulation of relationships, the building of trust and knowledge that made longer journeys possible. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, transformed these scattered networks into something more systematic. The Han emperors were ambitious rulers who sought to extend their influence beyond the traditional boundaries of Chinese civilization, and the western regions, the oases and steppes of Central Asia, beckoned with both threats and opportunities. Nomadic confederations on the northern frontier posed constant military challenges, and the Han needed horses to match their cavalry. The reports of wealthy kingdoms beyond the deserts stirred curiosity and ambition. Under Emperor Wu, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE, the Han court began to engage more actively with the world to the west. The man who opened this engagement was Zhang Qian, a palace official who volunteered for a mission that most considered suicidal. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu dispatched Zhang Qian westward with a small party of about 100 men, tasked with reaching the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had been driven from their homeland by the Xiongnu Confederacy and had settled somewhere in Central Asia. The emperor hoped to forge an alliance against the Xiongnu, using the Yuezhi's grievances to create a second front against his northern enemies. It was a diplomatic mission, not a military campaign, but it would require crossing territories controlled by the very enemies the Han hoped to encircle. Jiang Qian's journey became an epic of endurance and survival that would be celebrated in Chinese historical memory for millennia. Shortly after departing the Han frontiers, his party was captured by the Xiongnu and held prisoner. Jiang Qian was not executed. His diplomatic status may have provided some protection, but he was not permitted to continue his journey. He was given a wife, a Xiongnu woman, and settled into a captive life that lasted more than a decade. During these years, he observed Xiongnu customs, learned their language, and gathered information that would later prove valuable. But he never abandoned his mission. He kept the imperial credentials he had been given, waiting for an opportunity to escape and continue westward. After more than 10 years of captivity, Jiang Qian saw his chance. During a period of internal conflict among the Xiongnu, he escaped with his wife and a small party and continued westward. The journey was grueling, across deserts where water was scarce, over mountain passes choked with snow, through territories where the reception of strangers was unpredictable. He crossed the Pamirs into the Fergana Valley, a land of fine horses and settled agriculture that seemed like paradise after the hardships of the steppes. From there, he continued to Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan, where the Yuezhi had established themselves after their long migration from the Chinese frontier. The Yuezhi, however, were no longer interested in revenge against the Xiongnu. They had found new pastures and new concerns. The grievances that had driven them from their homeland had faded over the years of wandering and settlement. Jiang Qian's diplomatic mission failed in its primary objective. No alliance would be formed, no second front opened against the northern enemy, but his observations would prove far more valuable than any treaty. The journey home was almost as difficult as the journey out. Jiang Qian attempted a southern route to avoid the Xiongnu, but was captured again and held for another year. He escaped during another period of internal disorder, finally reaching the Han court in 126 BCE, 13 years after his departure. Of the original party of over 100 men, only Jiang Qian and one companion remained, but he brought with him something unprecedented: detailed reports of the peoples, roots, and goods of Central Asia that would reshape Chinese understanding of the world and set in motion centuries of engagement with the Western regions. He described the horses of Fergana, larger and stronger than any the Chinese had seen. He spoke of lands where grapes grew in abundance and wine was stored in great quantities. He mapped routes through the mountains and deserts, identified friendly and hostile peoples, and assessed the commercial and diplomatic potential of regions that had been mere rumors before. Emperor Wu was fascinated. He dispatched further missions to the west, sent armies to secure the Hexi Corridor, and established garrison towns and relay stations along the routes that Jiang Qian had described. The Han court began to send silk as diplomatic gifts and trade goods to the kingdoms of Central Asia, receiving horses and other luxuries in return. Over time, these exchanges became more regular, more systematic, protected by walls and watchtowers that extended Chinese influence deep into the western regions. The Jade Gate, Yumen Pass, marked the symbolic boundary between China proper and the lands beyond, a threshold that merchants and diplomats crossed with official documents and careful preparation. Silk became the signature good of this expanded trade. Chinese silk was unlike anything produced elsewhere in the ancient world. Finer, smoother, more lustrous than wool or linen. It draped the body in ways that seemed almost magical to those who first encountered it. The threads were extraordinarily thin, allowing for fabrics of remarkable delicacy and softness. The material held dyes brilliantly, producing colors that remained vivid even after years of use. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, comfortable against the skin in ways that coarser fabrics could not match. To wear silk was to display wealth and sophistication. To give silk was to honor and flatter the recipient. The techniques of sericulture, raising silkworms, unwinding their cocoons, weaving the threads into fabric, were closely guarded secrets, and for centuries Chinese producers maintained a near monopoly on silk production. The silkworms themselves were particular creatures, requiring specific conditions and foods to thrive. They fed exclusively on mulberry leaves, consuming vast quantities during their brief lives before spinning the cocoons that would yield their precious threads. Unwinding these cocoons was a delicate process. A single cocoon might yield 1,000 meters of continuous filament, but only if handled with care. The women who worked in silk production developed extraordinary skill, their fingers sensitive to the finest variations in thread quality. The fabric was light enough to carry across deserts and mountains in great quantities, valuable enough to justify the costs and risks of long-distance transport, and universally desired by elites who saw it as a mark of status and sophistication. Silk from China adorned Roman senators, Persian nobles, and Central Asian kings, each bolt a thread connecting distant worlds. Roman writers complained about the gold that flowed eastward to pay for silk, draining the empire's reserves to clothe its aristocrats in oriental finery. Persian courts developed their own traditions of silk use, incorporating the fabric into ceremonial dress and diplomatic gifts. The demand seemed inexhaustible, limited only by the supply that caravans could carry across the vast distances separating production from consumption. But silk was only part of a larger exchange. The Han imported horses, jade, furs, and exotic goods from the West. They exported silk, lacquerware, bronze mirrors, and other manufactured products. More importantly, they exported ideas, techniques for casting iron, methods of irrigation, systems of writing and administration that influenced the development of states along the Silk Roads. And they imported ideas in return, including, eventually, a religion that would transform Chinese civilization. Buddhism entered China along the same routes that carried silk westward, carried by monks and merchants who established communities in the oasis towns and eventually in the Chinese heartland itself. The roads that commerce built became highways of faith. To travel the Silk Roads was to surrender to slowness. The pace of a caravan was the pace of its slowest animal, and that pace rarely exceeded 30 or 40 kilometers on a good day, often much less when terrain was difficult or weather turned against the travelers. A journey from the borders of China to the markets of Persia might take a year or more, with long pauses in oasis towns waiting for passes to open or for political situations to stabilize. The merchants who made these journeys understood patience in ways that modern travelers can barely imagine. Time was not something to be saved or spent efficiently. It was simply the medium through which movement occurred, as inevitable and unhurried as the turning of seasons. A caravan was a community in motion. The word itself comes from the Persian Caravan, meaning a group of travelers, and the groups that crossed the Silk Roads could range from a handful of merchants with a few pack animals, to great trains of hundreds of camels, horses and mules, accompanied by handlers, cooks, guards and specialists of every kind. The organization of a caravan was a serious matter. Animals had to be selected and inspected, their loads balanced and secured. Supplies had to be calculated for the distances between reliable water sources, with margins for delay and disaster. Contracts had to be negotiated with guards and guides who knew the routes and could provide protection against bandits and the hazards of the road. A well-organized caravan was a small society with its own hierarchies and customs, its own rhythms of work and rest. The animals that carried the goods were as important as the merchants who traded them. Camels were the queens of the Silk Roads, adapted to conditions that would kill horses or mules within days. The Bactrian camel, with its 2 humps and thick coat, was suited to the cold, high routes of Central Asia, able to endure temperatures that would freeze a dromedary. Its humps stored fat that could sustain the animal through periods when food and water were scarce, and its broad, padded feet spread its weight across soft sand where narrower hooves would sink. The dromedary, with its single hump and lean build, was better suited to the hotter, more arid routes further south, where heat dissipation was more important than insulation against cold. Both species could travel for days without water, drawing on the fat stored in their humps, and both could carry loads of 200 kilograms or more across terrain that no wheeled vehicle could navigate. They could eat the thorny, tough vegetation of the desert that other animals could not digest, and they could close their nostrils against sandstorms that would blind and choke horses or mules. But camels were temperamental creatures, prone to biting and spitting, capable of holding grudges against handlers who had mistreated them. They required handlers who understood their moods and needs, who knew when to push and when to rest, who could coax cooperation from animals that seemed determined to be difficult. The relationship between a camel and its handler was intimate and essential. A good handler knew each animal individually, its strengths and weaknesses, its favorite foods, its particular quirks of behavior. He could read the signs of illness or exhaustion before they became serious, could adjust lows to prevent sores, could calm an animal spooked by unfamiliar sounds or smells. A mistreated camel could refuse to move, could sicken and die, could doom a caravan that depended on its strength. The successful conduct of Silk Road trade depended as much on the skills of camel handlers as on the negotiations of merchants. Horses and mules played supporting roles, carrying lighter loads or serving as mounts for merchants and guards who needed to move faster than the main caravan. Donkeys were common on shorter routes, their sure-footedness valuable on mountain paths too narrow for camels. Each animal had its place, its strengths and limitations, and the composition of a caravan's animal train reflected the specific challenges of the route it would travel. The day began before dawn. In the cool hours of early morning, the camp stirred to life. Handlers roused their animals, checked hooves and harnesses, distributed fodder and water. The camels groaned and complained as they were made to kneel for loading. Camels always complained. It was their nature. But experienced handlers knew how to work with their temperaments, calming the nervous ones, bullying the stubborn ones, moving efficiently through routines practiced thousands of times. Loads were inspected and adjusted, securing the bales and bundles that would shift with each step if not properly tied. A poorly balanced load could injure an animal, could cause goods to fall and be damaged or lost, could slow the entire caravan at a point where speed might mean the difference between reaching water and running out. The merchants performed their own rituals, checking accounts, consulting with guides about the day's route, saying prayers for safe passage. Many merchants carried small devotional items, Buddhist amulets, Islamic prayer beads, images of protective deities appropriate to their faiths. The journey was dangerous, and divine protection seemed as practical as any other precaution. Some performed brief ceremonies each morning, asking for guidance and safety. Others reserved their devotions for the rest stops and caravanserais, where there was time for more elaborate observance. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the caravan was moving. A long line of animals and people stretching across the landscape, raising a plume of dust that could be seen for miles. The order of march was not random. The lead animals were chosen for their steadiness and experience, setting a pace that the others would follow. Guards rode ahead and alongside, watching for signs of danger, bandits, terrain hazards, weather changes that might require shelter. The merchants walked or rode among their goods, keeping watch on their investments, adjusting loads that threatened to slip, noting any problems that might require attention at the next stop. Progress was measured by landmarks rather than hours. A distinctive rock formation, a dried riverbed, a particular bend in the path. These marked the stages of the journey, each one familiar to guides who had passed this way many times before. Periodic halts allowed animals to rest and drink, merchants to stretch their legs and check their goods, everyone to shelter from the midday sun when it became too fierce to travel. The afternoon often brought another period of movement, slower now as fatigue accumulated, until the caravan reached its destination for the night, a caravanserai, an oasis, or simply a spot where water could be found and camp made on the open ground. The evenings were times of quiet activity. Animals were unloaded, watered, and fed, a process that could take hours when a large caravan arrived at a stopping point. The handlers checked each animal for injuries, sores from poorly balanced loads, cuts from rough terrain, signs of illness that might worsen if left untreated. Hooves were inspected for stones or cracks. Harnesses were examined for worn spots that might break under strain. These small attentions were not optional. The life of the caravan depended on its animals, and a handler who neglected his charges could find himself stranded in the desert with a lame camel and a load he could not carry. Tents were pitched or rooms claimed in whatever shelter the stopping point provided. Meals were prepared over small fires, simple fare of bread, dried meat, dates, and whatever fresh food might be available. The bread was often flatbread, baked quickly on hot stones or in the ashes of the fire, versatile enough to serve as plate and utensil as well as food. Rice, where available, was a luxury. Meat was preserved by salting or drying, to be reconstituted in stews that stretched limited supplies across many meals. Tea became increasingly important along the eastern routes, its warmth welcome in cold mountain camps, its stimulant properties helping tired travelers through long days. Merchants gathered to share news and negotiate, exchanging information about conditions ahead, about prices in distant markets, about the political situations that might affect their routes. These conversations were the intelligence network of the Silk Roads, informal but essential, spreading information faster than any official courier could carry it. A merchant arriving from Samarkand might warn of bandits on the road to Bukhara. Another arriving from Kashgar might report that the passes into the Pamirs had opened earlier than usual. Prices could be gauged, partnerships formed, deals struck that would be completed weeks or months later when caravans met again in distant cities. The conversations mixed languages and accents, traders from a dozen regions finding common ground, in the universal language of commerce. And when the talking was done, when the fires burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, the camp fell into silence. The only sounds the breathing of sleeping animals and the whisper of wind across the sand. The work of maintaining a caravan was endless. Harnesses frayed and had to be mended, leather dried and cracked in the desert air, stitching came loose under the strain of heavy loads, buckles wore thin and needed replacement. Animals developed sores from poorly balanced loads and required treatment. Left untended, a small sore could become an infected wound that crippled a valuable beast. Waterskins leaked and had to be patched or replaced. A leaking waterskin in the desert could mean the difference between survival and death. Saddles needed adjustment as animals lost or gained weight over the course of a long journey. Ropes that secured loads stretched and loosened, requiring constant attention to prevent cargo from shifting or falling. Accounts had to be kept, recording every transaction, every expense, every debt owed and payment received. The merchants who succeeded on long-distance routes were meticulous record keepers, their ledgers documenting the purchases and sales that determined whether a journey ended in profit or loss. They noted the prices paid for goods at their origin and the prices received at their destination, calculating the margins that justified the risks and expenses of travel. They tracked the wages paid to guards and handlers, the costs of fodder and provisions, the fees extracted by local authorities, and the bribes demanded by those whose cooperation could not be obtained otherwise. The merchants who succeeded on the Silk Roads were not romantics seeking adventure. They were practical men who understood that profit depended on attention to detail, on the 1,000 small tasks that kept animals healthy, goods secure, and relationships intact. The glamour was in the goods they carried, silks and spices, gems and gold. But the reality was sweat and patience, the daily discipline of movement and maintenance that made long-distance trade possible. A merchant who neglected these details, who focused on the romance of distant markets while ignoring the mundane work of keeping his caravan functioning, would soon find himself ruined. His animals dead, his goods spoiled, his capital exhausted by the costs of incompetence. The caravanserais were the anchors of this system, the fixed points around which the rhythm of travel organized itself. These roadside inns dotted the routes of the Silk Roads, especially in the Islamic world and Central Asia, providing shelter, water, and security for travelers who might otherwise have faced the dangers of the open road alone. A typical caravanserai followed a simple design refined over centuries of use. High walls enclosed a courtyard large enough to accommodate dozens of camels and their loads. In the largest examples, hundreds of animals could be housed simultaneously. Gates that could be closed and barred at night protected against bandits and wild animals. Some caravanserais maintained guards who patrolled the walls and controlled access. Around the inner perimeter, rooms provided sleeping quarters for merchants, storage for goods, and stables for animals. The layout was practical rather than luxurious. Merchants of higher status might claim rooms with better ventilation or more privacy, but the basic accommodation was similar for all. A well or cistern in the courtyard ensured access to water. Often the most precious resource on desert routes, carefully maintained and sometimes jealously guarded. Some caravanserais were modest structures, bare walls and packed earth, offering little more than security and shade. These served the basic needs of travelers on less frequented routes, providing a defensible perimeter and a reliable water source without any pretense of comfort. Others were elaborate complexes with bathhouses, mosques, and separate quarters for merchants of different ranks and origins. The grandest served as social centers, places where news was exchanged, contracts negotiated, and relationships built that might last for generations. Some included warehouses where goods could be stored between seasons, allowing merchants to buy when prices were low and sell when they rose. A few even included permanent shops, creating small bazaars that served both travelers and local populations. The spacing of caravanserais reflected the practical limits of daily travel. In well-served regions, they stood about a day's journey apart, 30 or 40 kilometers, ensuring that a caravan could always reach shelter before nightfall. In more remote areas, the distances were greater, and travelers might spend nights in the open between stops. The construction and maintenance of caravanserais was often a matter of state policy or charitable endowment. Rulers understood that trade depended on infrastructure, and pious donors saw the support of travelers as a religious duty. The great caravanserais of Central Asia and Persia were monuments to this understanding, some of them surviving today as reminders of the networks they once served. Within the walls of a caravanserai, a temporary community formed each night. Merchants from different regions shared food and conversation, comparing routes and prices, warning of dangers, and recommending reliable contacts. The diversity could be remarkable. A single caravanserai might host Chinese traders carrying silk, Persian merchants with carpets, Indian dealers in spices, Arabs trading in incense and horses, local farmers selling provisions to all comers. Each group might keep somewhat to itself. Language barriers and cultural differences did not disappear within caravanserai walls, but the necessity of sharing space created opportunities for exchange that transcended these divisions. Pilgrims bound for distant shrines mingled with traders bound for distant markets. Buddhist monks traveling to or from India shared courtyard space with Muslim merchants performing their prayers. Scholars carried manuscripts that might contain knowledge unknown in the lands they traveled through: astronomical tables, medical texts, religious scriptures, collections of poetry. The caravanserai was a listening place, where many languages could be heard and many stories told, where the isolation of the road gave way, for a few hours, to the warmth of human company. The social rituals of the caravanserai were well established by centuries of practice. Newcomers announced themselves to the keeper and negotiated for space. Better rooms went to those who arrived early, who paid more, or who had established relationships with the caravanserai's management. Animals were led to their quarters and attended to before their handlers sought their own rest. A responsible merchant saw to his animals first, knowing that his fortune depended on their health. Meals were shared around common fires or purchased from cooks who made their living serving travelers. The food was simple but hot, a welcome change from the cold provisions of the road. In the evenings, the courtyard might fill with the sound of music or storytelling, merchants relaxing after the day's journey, pilgrims gathering for prayers, everyone grateful for walls against the darkness and company against the silence. Some caravanserais developed reputations for particular entertainments: musicians who performed, storytellers who recounted tales of heroes and lovers, games of chance where fortunes could be won or lost in a single evening. The caravanserai was not home, but it was the closest thing to home that the road could offer, a place of safety and society in a landscape that offered little of either. Smaller stops supplemented the caravanserais on less traveled routes. Simple wells maintained by local communities provided water for passing caravans. Watchtowers offered shelter and sometimes a small garrison for protection. Village inns, modest structures with few amenities, served travelers who could not reach a larger stop before nightfall. These smaller nodes were essential to the network, filling the gaps between major caravanserais, ensuring that no stretch of route was too long for a laden caravan to cross. Together, the caravanserais and their smaller siblings created a system that made long-distance travel possible. Not easy, never comfortable, but at least survivable for those with patience and resources. The cities of the Silk Roads were not destinations so much as pauses, places where journeys rested before continuing, where goods changed hands and stories were told, where the cultures of distant lands met and mingled in markets and workshops. Each city occupied a particular position in the network, its importance determined by geography and history, by the routes that passed through it, and the resources it could offer to travelers. Chang'an, near the site of modern Xi'an, was the eastern anchor of the Silk Roads during the great dynasties of Han and Tang. This was no provincial outpost. It was one of the largest cities in the world, home at its peak to perhaps 1 million people, a planned metropolis of broad avenues and ordered districts. The city was laid out on a grid, its streets aligned with the cardinal directions, its walls enclosing an area larger than contemporary Rome or Constantinople. The imperial palace occupied the northern portion. Markets, residences, and workshops filled the rest. Foreign quarters housed merchants and diplomats from distant lands, Persians and Sogdians, Indians and Arabs, who brought their goods and their gods to the Chinese capital. The Sogdians were particularly prominent. These Iranian-speaking merchants from Central Asia dominated long-distance trade for centuries, their colonies scattered along the Silk Roads from China to Byzantium. They were famous as middlemen, as translators, as bankers who could arrange credit across vast distances. Their presence in Chang'an testified to the city's cosmopolitan character, its role as a meeting point for peoples from across the known world. Markets displayed wares from across the known world, silks and ceramics of local manufacture alongside furs from the steppes, gems from India, glassware from the Mediterranean. The Western market, in particular, was known for its foreign goods and foreign visitors. A Chinese poet wrote of its Babel of languages, its exotic scents, its dancers and musicians from distant lands. The city was a showcase of imperial power and cosmopolitan sophistication, a place where a traveler from the far west could see the culmination of the journeys that brought goods eastward. But Chang'an was also a departure point, the place where journeys westward began. Merchants gathered their caravans in the suburbs, loading the goods they hoped to sell in distant markets, hiring the guides and guards who would protect them on the road. Diplomats received their credentials and instructions before setting out to negotiate with foreign rulers. Monks carrying Buddhist scriptures began the long journey toward their homeland in India, or return from pilgrimages to the sacred sites of the Buddha's life. The city's western gates opened onto roads that led, eventually, to every corner of the known world. Dunhuang stood at the other end of the Hexi corridor, marking the transition from China proper to the western regions. This was a frontier town, smaller and rougher than Chang'an, but vital to the functioning of the Silk Roads. Here, caravans made their final preparations before entering the deserts of the Tarim Basin, checking supplies, hiring local guides, waiting for news of conditions on the routes ahead. Merchants who had crossed the deserts from the west arrived here exhausted and relieved, ready to rest and resupply before the final leg of their journey to the Chinese interior. The town's famous caves, carved into the cliffs nearby and filled with Buddhist paintings and sculptures, testified to its importance as a religious center, a place where travelers prayed for safe passage and gave thanks for journeys completed. The Mogao Caves, as they are now known, contain artwork spanning nearly a millennium, depicting Buddhist teachings in styles that blend Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese traditions. A hidden library discovered in one cave contained thousands of manuscripts in multiple languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, and others, preserving texts that had been lost elsewhere, including the oldest printed book known to exist. West of Dunhuang, the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin served as stepping stones across the desert. Turfan and Kucha on the northern route, Khotan and Nia on the southern. Each city a green island surrounded by sand, sustained by rivers flowing down from the mountains or by underground channels that tapped ancient aquifers. These were not large cities by Chinese or Persian standards, but they were essential nodes in the network, places where caravans could rest and resupply, where local merchants connected long-distance traders with regional markets, where the goods of East and West met and mingled. Kashgar occupied a special position at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, where the northern and southern routes converged before climbing into the Pamirs. This was a crossroads city, a place where all paths met, where the cultural influences of China, India, Central Asia, and the Islamic world intersected. The bazaars of Kashgar offered goods from every direction: Chinese silks alongside Indian spices, Central Asian horses alongside Persian carpets. The languages heard in its streets were equally varied, a babel of tongues that testified to the city's role as a meeting place for peoples who would never have encountered each other otherwise. Beyond the mountains, the cities of Central Asia proper had their own characters and histories. Samarkand, in the fertile valley of the Zarafshan River, was one of the oldest and most celebrated cities of the Silk Roads. Human settlement in the area dates back thousands of years, and the city had been a significant center long before the routes that would later bear the name Silk Road took their mature form. Alexander the Great had marveled at its gardens and palaces when he passed through in 329 BCE, describing it as finer than he had expected. The city had been destroyed and rebuilt many times by Greeks, by nomadic invaders, by Arabs, by Mongols, but it had always risen again, its location too strategic, its water supply too reliable, its position in the network of routes too valuable to abandon. By the medieval period, Samarkand was famous for the quality of its manufactured goods. Paper made from mulberry bark, superior to anything produced further west. Metalwork of exceptional skill. Textiles that combined local traditions with techniques learned from Chinese, Persian, and Indian craftsmen. The city's markets drew merchants from across the connected world, their languages mixing in the bazaars, their goods piled in the caravanserais that lined the approaches to the city. The city had been conquered and reconquered many times by Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols, but it had always rebuilt, always resumed its role as a hub, where routes converged and goods changed hands. The great square of Registan, though dating from a later period under Timurid rule, embodies the spirit of the city, a place of commerce and culture, where the practical business of trade was conducted amid monuments that spoke of power and piety. 3 madrasas, Islamic colleges, face each other across the square, their facades covered with intricate tilework in shades of blue and gold, their minarets rising against the Central Asian sky. The scale and beauty of these buildings testified to the wealth their trade had brought, to the ambitions of rulers who sought to make their cities showcases of civilization. Bukhara stood further west, another oasis city sustained by irrigation and trade. It was known throughout the Islamic world as a center of learning, home to madrasas and mosques that drew scholars from across the Muslim lands. The theologian al-Bukhari, whose collection of hadith, sayings of the Prophet, remains one of the most authoritative in Sunni Islam, was born near the city and bore its name. The philosopher and physician Ibn Sina spent part of his career there. The city's libraries held manuscripts on every subject: theology, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, literature, accumulated over centuries of patronage and study. But Bukhara was also a commercial city, its markets filled with the products of Central Asia and the lands beyond. Carpets and textiles, spices and dried fruits, slaves and horses, all passed through Bukhara's bazaars, traded by merchants who spoke Persian and Arabic, Turkish and Chinese, and half a dozen other languages besides. The covered bazaars, with their domed ceilings and cool interiors, provided relief from the summer heat that baked the surrounding plains. The city's fame extended to Europe, where Bukhara became a byword for exotic luxury, a name attached to carpets and designs that might never have been near the actual city. Merv lay further west still, on the edge of the Iranian plateau in what is now Turkmenistan. This was an ancient city, one of the great urban centers of antiquity, sustained by irrigation systems that transformed the surrounding desert into productive farmland. The Murghab River provided water for a network of canals that spread across the oasis, supporting agriculture on a scale that seems remarkable given the aridity of the surrounding region. At its height in the 11th and 12th centuries, Merv may have been one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling Baghdad and Constantinople in population, its libraries and mosques drawing scholars from across the Islamic world. The city was a center of scholarship and religion, home to Christians, Zoroastrians, Buddhists and Muslims at various points in its long history. This religious diversity reflected its position at the crossroads of cultures, where travelers from many traditions passed through and sometimes settled. It was also a crucial node on the routes connecting Central Asia to Persia and beyond, a place where caravans from the east met caravans from the west and exchanged their goods. The markets of Merv offered products from across the connected world: Chinese silk and Central Asian horses, Indian spices and Persian metalwork, the accumulated goods of a continent brought together in a single marketplace. The Mongol conquest devastated Merv in 1221, when the city fell to Tolui, son of Genghis Khan. The destruction was appalling. According to Persian historians, the entire population was slaughtered, the irrigation systems destroyed, the libraries burned. The figures given by chroniclers, hundreds of thousands killed, may be exaggerated, but there is no doubt that Merv was catastrophically depopulated. Its position as a great city ended in a few terrible days. The city would never recover its former glory, but for 1,000 years before that destruction, it had been one of the great cities of the Silk Roads, a testament to what patient exchange and accumulated wealth could build. These cities were not merely commercial centers. They were places where people lived, worked, and built communities that persisted for generations. Craftsmen produced goods for local consumption, as well as long-distance trade. Potters making vessels for daily use, smiths forging tools and weapons, weavers creating fabrics for ordinary people, as well as the fine textiles that traveled to distant markets. Farmers worked the fields and orchards that surrounded the urban cores, providing food for residents and travelers alike. Irrigation systems, some of them engineering marvels maintained over centuries, brought water from distant sources to sustain agriculture in lands that would otherwise have been barren. Religious institutions, temples, mosques, churches, monasteries, offered spiritual sustenance and social services. They educated children, cared for the sick, provided hospitality to travelers, and served as repositories of learning and tradition. The great Buddhist caves of Dunhuang preserved paintings and manuscripts across centuries of political change. The mosques and madrasas of Bukhara trained generations of scholars in religious and secular learning. These institutions gave cities a stability that transcended the fluctuations of trade, providing continuity even when commerce declined. Markets were the beating hearts of these cities, places where local production met long-distance trade. The bazaars were organized by craft and commodity. A street of metal workers here, a quarter of textile merchants there, a section devoted to spices and another to livestock. Prices were negotiated rather than fixed, and skill in bargaining was valued alongside quality of goods. The sounds of the market, the calls of vendors, the chatter of customers, the clatter of coins changing hands formed a constant background to urban life, and the smells, spices piled in open sacks, leather being tanned, bread baking in clay ovens, animals being slaughtered and butchered. The sensory richness of a Silk Road bazaar was overwhelming to newcomers, a cacophony of impressions that regular visitors learned to navigate and appreciate. The Silk Roads passed through these cities, but they did not define them. Each city had its own life, its own concerns, its own history that extended beyond its role as a node in a network. Yet the networks mattered. The prosperity of these cities depended on the trade that flowed through them, on the merchants who spent their money in local markets, on the goods that could be taxed as they entered and departed. When trade flourished, the cities flourished. When trade declined, the cities shrank. The rise of maritime routes in the 15th and 16th centuries gradually shifted the balance of long-distance commerce away from the overland roads, and many Silk Road cities dwindled as a result. But they did not disappear. They remained inhabited, their markets and workshops serving regional needs even as their role in global trade diminished. The paths that had made them important were still there, still serving travelers who moved between nearby communities, still connecting places that had been connected for millennia. The goods that traveled the Silk Roads were tangible things: bolts of silk, bags of spices, bundles of furs. But the ideas that traveled alongside them were often more transformative. Beliefs, technologies, and stories moved across the same routes, carried not in crates, but in the minds of merchants, monks, and scholars who settled in new cities and shared what they knew with new audiences. The Silk Roads were highways of thought, and the exchanges they fostered shaped civilizations in ways that no trade in goods alone could have accomplished. Buddhism offers perhaps the most dramatic example of this cultural transmission. The religion had originated in the Indian subcontinent, in the teachings of a prince who renounced his wealth to seek enlightenment. The Buddha's message that suffering could be overcome through right understanding and right action had spread through India in the centuries after his death, carried by monks who established communities of practitioners and by lay supporters who built monasteries and funded teaching. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, Buddhist monks and merchants were carrying these teachings along the trade routes into Central Asia and beyond. The two groups often traveled together, the monks providing spiritual services to the merchants providing material support to the monks. Buddhism proved well suited to the cosmopolitan world of the Silk Roads. It did not require adherence to a particular ethnic identity or social system. It offered comfort to travelers far from home, and it provided a common framework that could bridge different cultures and languages. The oasis cities of the Tarim Basin became centers of Buddhist learning, their monasteries filled with monks who translated sacred texts and practiced meditation in caves carved into the desert cliffs. These cave temples, of which the most famous are those at Dunhuang and the Kizil caves near Kucha, were decorated with paintings and sculptures that blended Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese artistic traditions. The images depicted the Buddha and his teachings, the stories of his previous lives, the paradise that awaited the faithful. They served as aids to meditation and instruction, visual representations of concepts that text alone could not convey. From these centers, Buddhism spread into China, adapting to local cultures, merging with indigenous traditions, eventually becoming one of the great religions of East Asia. Chinese pilgrims made long, dangerous journeys to India to study at the sources of Buddhist teaching and to bring back texts for translation. The most famous of these pilgrims, Chang'an, traveled for 16 years in the 7th century, visiting holy sites and studying with masters across India before returning to China with hundreds of manuscripts. His journey, later fictionalized in the classic novel Journey to the West, captures the devotion and determination that drove religious exchange along the Silk Roads. The transmission was slow, patient, cumulative. A monk might spend decades in a foreign city, learning the local language, translating a single text, training a handful of students who would carry the work forward after his death. The challenges were immense. Languages with different structures and vocabularies, concepts that had no equivalence in the target culture, scripts that had to be mastered before any work could begin. Translation was not merely a matter of substituting words, but of finding ways to convey ideas that the receiving culture might never have considered. Buddhist concepts like karma, dharma, and nirvana had no ready equivalents in Chinese. Translators had to decide whether to adapt existing Chinese terms, to create new ones, or to transliterate Sanskrit words and hope that readers would learn their meanings. Merchants who encountered Buddhist communities on their travels might adopt elements of the faith, carrying statues and scriptures home to their families. The portable arts of Buddhism, small bronze figures, painted scrolls, carved amulets, spread along trade routes, finding new homes in distant cities where they might inspire curiosity, devotion, or both. Pilgrims made long, dangerous journeys to visit the sites of the Buddha's life, bringing back relics and manuscripts that became treasured possessions of their home monasteries. The spread of Buddhism was not a single event, but a process extending over centuries, shaped by countless individual decisions to learn, to teach, to believe. Other religions followed similar paths. Manichaeism, a dualistic faith combining elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism, spread along the Silk Roads from its origins in Persia, finding converts in Central Asia and China, before eventually dying out in most regions. Its founder, Mani, had deliberately created a missionary religion, designing rituals and scriptures that could be adapted to different cultures. But even with this intentional universalism, the spread of his faith depended on the same slow processes that carried other religions: individual conversion, community formation, gradual transmission from master to student. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of the faith that emphasized the human nature of Christ, established communities along the trade routes, leaving traces in archaeological sites from the Persian Gulf to the Chinese coast. These Christians were often merchants, their faith traveling with their goods, their churches rising in trading cities where communities of the faithful gathered for worship. A famous stele discovered in Xi'an records the arrival of Nestorian Christianity in Tang, China. describing the faith in terms that sought to make it comprehensible to Chinese audiences. Islam, emerging in the 7th century, spread rapidly along existing trade networks, carried by merchants and scholars who saw no contradiction between commerce and faith. The new religion offered a comprehensive framework for personal and social life, including rules for commercial transactions that created trust among traders who might otherwise have been strangers. Muslim merchants became dominant on many Silk Road routes, their shared faith providing the basis for partnerships and credit arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade. The Silk Roads did not create these religions, but they provided the channels through which they flowed, the connections that allowed local faiths to become world religions. Technologies moved as well, though their transmission was often harder to trace than the movement of physical goods. Papermaking, developed in China during the Han Dynasty, gradually spread westward, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century and Europe by the 12th. The traditional story attributes this spread to the capture of Chinese papermakers at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. But the technology may have traveled through more gradual channels as well, through merchants who observed the process, through craftsmen who emigrated, through the slow diffusion of technique from workshop to workshop across the connected world. Whatever the exact mechanism, the technology transformed scholarship and administration, making written records cheaper and more accessible, enabling the flowering of literature and science that followed. Silk production itself eventually spread beyond China, though the process took centuries. According to legend, silkworm eggs were smuggled out of China, hidden in a bamboo staff or in the headdress of a princess. The reality was probably more complex, involving multiple routes of transmission and gradual accumulation of knowledge. By the 6th century, silk was being produced in the Byzantine Empire, though Chinese silk remained prized for its superior quality. By the medieval period, silk industries flourished across the Islamic world and southern Europe, each region developing its own traditions and specialties while drawing on techniques that had originated in China. The techniques of metalworking, of glassmaking, of ceramic production. All of these crossed borders and oceans, carried by craftsmen who emigrated or by traders who observed and reported what they saw. Chinese porcelain, with its translucent body and brilliant glazes, was imitated across the Islamic world and eventually in Europe, though it took centuries for Western potters to discover the kaolin clay that gave Chinese ware its distinctive qualities. Glass, which had been developed in the ancient Near East, spread eastward along the Silk Roads, reaching China, where it remained a luxury imported good rather than a local product. Each technology that traveled created new possibilities in the lands it reached, sparking innovations that combined imported knowledge with local traditions. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge flowed along the Silk Roads in particularly rich streams. Indian mathematicians developed the numeral system that we use today, including the concept of zero as a placeholder and a number in its own right. These innovations spread westward, adopted by Arab and Persian scholars who refined and extended them, eventually reaching Europe, where they revolutionized commerce and science. Greek astronomical knowledge, preserved in the libraries of the Islamic world, mingled with Indian and Persian traditions to produce new syntheses that advanced understanding of the heavens. The observatories of Samarkand and other Central Asian cities produced star catalogues and planetary tables of unprecedented accuracy, drawing on knowledge gathered from across the connected world. The transmission of ideas required more than mere contact. It required translation, interpretation, the patient work of rendering concepts from one language and culture into another. The Silk Road cities were home to communities of translators and scribes who made their living bridging linguistic divides. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom assembled scholars from across the Islamic world to translate Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, creating a corpus of knowledge that would later flow back into Europe and contribute to the Renaissance. In Dunhuang and other Buddhist centers, monks labored for decades to render Sanskrit sutras into Chinese, grappling with concepts that had no easy equivalents in the target language. These translators were the unsung heroes of cultural exchange, the people who made it possible for ideas to cross the boundaries of language and take root in new soil. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries, represented a high point of this intellectual exchange. The Islamic world stretched from Al-Andalus in the west to Central Asia in the east, encompassing much of the Silk Roads within a single cultural and commercial sphere. Arabic and Persian became languages of trade, scholarship, and administration across this vast territory, allowing ideas to flow with unprecedented freedom. A scholar in Cordoba could correspond with colleagues in Samarkand, both writing in Arabic, discussing texts that drew on Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources. The political fragmentation of the Islamic world, it was never a single unified empire, did not prevent this intellectual unity. Scholars and merchants moved freely across boundaries that divided rulers but not cultures. The scholars of this era were voracious in their curiosity, seeking knowledge from every source available. They translated Greek philosophical works that had been forgotten or neglected in Europe. The writings of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, preserving and extending the intellectual heritage of antiquity. They engaged with Indian mathematics and astronomy, integrating these traditions with their own and with Greek knowledge to produce new syntheses. They developed new sciences, algebra, from the Arabic al-jabr, optics, chemistry, from alchemia, that would later transform European thought. The very vocabulary of modern science bears witness to this transmission, with words like algorithm, zenith, nadir, and cipher, all derived from Arabic. The great libraries of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo held manuscripts from every corner of the known world, assembled by rulers and scholars who understood that knowledge was power and that trade in ideas could be as valuable as trade in goods. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, was perhaps the most famous of these institutions, a center for translation and research that brought together scholars of different faiths and origins to work on common projects. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars collaborated on translations from Greek and Syriac. Persian and Indian knowledge entered the Arabic corpus alongside Greek. New discoveries were made that advanced human understanding beyond anything the ancients had achieved. The cities of Central Asia participated fully in this flowering. Bukhara was famous for its scholars and its madrasas, institutions of learning that attracted students from across the Islamic world. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was born near Bukhara and produced works on the medicine and philosophy that remained authoritative for centuries. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, worked at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, but drew on knowledge that had traveled the Silk Roads from India. The geographer Al-Idrisi, working at the court of Norman Sicily, compiled information gathered from travelers and merchants into maps that represented the state of geographical knowledge in the 12th century. These scholars were products of the connected world that the Silk Roads had created, drawing on traditions and sources that no single civilization could have produced alone. Trade and scholarship reinforced each other, Merchants provided the wealth that supported institutions of learning. They also provided information about distant lands, reports of customs and resources that scholars incorporated into their works. The legal and financial instruments developed by Islamic merchants, partnerships, letters of credit, contracts that could be enforced across borders, made long-distance trade more reliable and more profitable, encouraging further exchange. The stability and prosperity of the Islamic world during this period created conditions in which both commerce and culture could flourish, building on foundations that the earlier Silk Roads had laid. The 13th century brought a convulsion that reshaped the Silk Roads more dramatically than any event since their origins. The Mongol conquests, led by Genghis Khan and continued by his successors, created the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Poland, from the Siberian forests to the Persian Gulf. The destruction was immense. Cities were razed, populations slaughtered, centuries of accumulated wealth dispersed or destroyed. Merv, once one of the world's largest cities, was virtually annihilated. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, was sacked and its libraries burned. The scale of death was staggering, depopulating vast regions that would take centuries to recover. But from this devastation emerged a new order, a political framework that linked regions previously divided by multiple frontiers, creating conditions for exchange on an unprecedented scale. The Mongol rulers, for all their brutality and conquest, proved capable administrators who understood that prosperous subjects generated more revenue than devastated wastelands. They rebuilt cities, restored irrigation systems, and established structures of governance that allowed commerce to resume. Historians call this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, a term that obscures the violence of the conquests but captures something real about what followed. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Roads experienced a period of relative safety that made long-distance travel easier than it had been for centuries. The Mongol authorities maintained relay stations across their vast territories where messengers and officials could change horses and rest, ensuring that communications could move with remarkable speed across thousands of miles. A message could travel from the Mongol capital at Karakoram to outposts on the Persian frontier in a matter of weeks, carried by riders who changed mounts at each station, galloping day and night through territories that recognized the authority of the Khan's seal. They suppressed banditry along the major routes, punishing severely any interference with trade. The punishment for robbing merchants under Mongol protection was death, and the Mongols had demonstrated their willingness to enforce such penalties with exemplary violence. Merchants could travel with confidence that local authorities would protect their persons and goods, or face the consequences of failing to do so. They issued safe conduct documents that allowed merchants to travel under imperial protection, their papers bearing stamps that officials throughout the empire were trained to recognize and respect. The empire was divided among the descendants of Genghis Khan, but the divisions did not prevent movement across borders. The Golden Horde controlled the western steppes from Russia to the Caspian. The Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia. The Ilkhanate governed Persia and much of the Middle East. The Yuan dynasty held China. Despite frequent conflicts among these successor states, the framework of Mongol rule created a common zone within which travelers could move with relative freedom. A merchant setting out from the Black Sea could travel to Beijing using roads and relay stations maintained by Mongol authorities, speaking with officials who shared a common administrative heritage. This environment enabled journeys that would have been nearly impossible in earlier periods. Missionaries and diplomats crossed the entire breadth of Asia, returning with reports that astonished European audiences. Craftsmen and scholars moved between courts, carrying skills and knowledge that spread throughout the Mongol domains. Merchants from Italy and Persia established themselves in Chinese cities, trading goods and exchanging information across distances that earlier generations could barely have imagined. The Silk Roads, which had always been networks of many short journeys, now saw travelers who crossed continents in single expeditions. Among these travelers was a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, whose account of his journeys became one of the most famous books of the medieval world. Marco Polo traveled to China in the company of his father and uncle, merchants who had made the journey before and established contacts at the court of Kublai Khan. They departed Venice in 1271 and did not return until 1295, spending nearly 2 decades in the Mongol domains, much of it reportedly in the service of the Khan himself. Marco Polo's account, dictated while he was imprisoned in Genoa after a naval battle, described the cities and customs of China, the organization of the Mongol Empire, the goods and peoples encountered along the way. The book was extraordinary for its detail and its scope. Marco Polo described the paper money used in China, a concept so strange to European readers that many thought he was lying. He described the coal that Chinese burned for fuel, the vast postal system that carried messages across the empire, the cities whose populations dwarfed anything in Europe. He spoke of silk and spices, of palaces and customs, of technologies and traditions that seemed to come from another world. Whether all his claims were true, scholars still debate whether he actually visited all the places he described. The book captured European imagination and shaped perceptions of Asia for centuries. But it is important to place Marco Polo in context. He was not the discoverer of the Silk Roads, nor even a particularly unusual traveler by the standards of his time. Many merchants had made similar journeys before him. Many would make them after. Italian traders from Venice, Genoa, and other cities had established communities in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, from which some ventured further along the routes that led to China. Persian and Arab merchants had been traveling these paths for centuries, their journeys unremarked because they left no books that survived in European libraries. What made Marco Polo famous was not his travels but his book. The fact that he produced a detailed written account that circulated widely in Europe and captured the imagination of readers who would never see the places he described. His narrative is valuable, but it is one observer's account within a much larger, older system of movement. The Silk Roads did not begin when Marco Polo set out, nor did they end when he returned. They continued, as they had always continued, carrying goods and ideas between regions that would otherwise have remained strangers. For every Marco Polo whose name we know, there were thousands of merchants whose journeys were never recorded, whose contributions to the connected world remain anonymous. The Pax Mongolica did not last. The Mongol Empire fragmented over the 14th century, its unity giving way to competing successor states that often viewed each other with hostility. Civil wars, succession disputes, and regional rivalries disrupted the networks of communication and commerce that had linked the empire together. The Black Death, spreading along trade routes from Central Asia to Europe in the 1340s, devastated populations across the connected world and disrupted the commercial networks that had flourished under Mongol rule. Some estimates suggest that half the population of affected regions died within a few years, a catastrophe that reshaped societies and economies in ways that took generations to overcome. Political instability returned to the Silk Roads, making long-distance travel more dangerous and less predictable. The security that had allowed merchants to cross continents under Mongol protection gave way to a patchwork of competing authorities, each with its own rules, its own demands, its own dangers. Routes that had been safe became hazardous. Distances that had been manageable became daunting. The great era of overland exchange was drawing to a close. The decline of the Silk Roads was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual shift in the balance of long-distance trade. From the late medieval period onward, maritime routes increasingly carried the goods that had once traveled overland. Ships could transport larger quantities more cheaply than caravans. A single large vessel could carry cargo that would have required hundreds of camels to move by land. Ships could bypass the middlemen who added costs at every exchange point along the overland routes, allowing merchants to buy goods at their source and sell them directly in consuming markets. They could reach markets inaccessible to land routes: Southeast Asia, the Indonesian archipelago, the coastal cities of India and Africa, expanding the geography of trade beyond what any overland network could serve. The technology of shipbuilding and navigation improved steadily through the medieval period. Chinese junks grew larger and more seaworthy, their watertight compartments and adjustable sails allowing them to venture safely across open ocean. Arab dhows plied the Indian Ocean, their lateen sails catching the monsoon winds that made predictable seasonal voyages possible. The magnetic compass, developed in China and spread along the Silk Roads themselves, revolutionized navigation, allowing sailors to find their way even when clouds obscured the stars. The Portuguese discovery of a sea route to India in 1498 marked a turning point, opening direct maritime connections between Europe and the spice markets of Asia. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope demonstrated that European ships could reach the sources of goods that had previously passed through many hands before arriving in Mediterranean ports. The subsequent development of Atlantic trade routes, connecting Europe to the Americas and through them to the Pacific, further shifted the center of gravity of global commerce away from the overland roads that had served for millennia. The Silk Roads did not disappear. They continued to serve regional and local traffic, connecting communities that had been connected for millennia. Caravans still crossed the deserts of Central Asia, carrying goods between cities that still needed what their neighbors produced. Pilgrims still traveled to shrines and holy places, following routes their predecessors had walked for centuries. The infrastructure of trade, the caravanserais, the wells, the paths worn into the landscape, remained, even as the volume of long-distance trade declined. What changed was not the existence of the routes, but their relative importance in a world increasingly connected by ocean highways. The cities of the Silk Roads adapted to new circumstances. Some, like Samarkand and Bukhara, remained important regional centers, serving territories that could not easily be reached by sea. Their markets continued to function, their craftsmen continued to produce, their scholars continued to teach, but the scale was diminished, the horizons narrower. Samarkand, which had once welcomed merchants from China and India, Rome and Persia, now served primarily Central Asian traders moving goods between neighboring regions. The great caravanserais fell into disrepair when there were no longer enough long-distance travelers to fill them. The networks of relay stations that had connected the Mongol domains were no longer maintained. Others declined more dramatically, their populations shrinking as the trade that had sustained them diminished, their buildings crumbling into ruins that would fascinate later travelers and archaeologists. The great empires that had once fought for control of the Silk Roads, Chinese, Persian, Mongol, gave way to new powers whose interest lay elsewhere, whose wealth derived from oceanic trade and colonial exploitation rather than overland commerce. The routes that had once carried the wealth of nations became in many places dusty tracks serving local farmers and herders, their former glory preserved only in ruins and memories. Travelers in the 19th and early 20th centuries described abandoned caravanserais, crumbling walls, cities that seemed to be slowly returning to the desert from which they had been carved. But the legacy of the Silk Roads extended far beyond the routes themselves. The exchanges they had fostered, of goods, of ideas, of people, had laid the foundations for the connected world that followed. The religions that had spread along these paths continued to shape cultures across Asia and beyond. Buddhism, which had traveled from India to China along trade routes, became the dominant faith of East Asia, shaping art, philosophy, and social organization for billions of people. Islam, which had spread along Silk Road networks, unified communities from Morocco to Indonesia under a shared framework of belief and practice. Christianity, in its various forms, had traveled these routes as well, establishing communities that persisted for centuries in regions far from its origins. The technologies that had been transmitted, papermaking, printing, gunpowder, the compass, transformed societies that had never seen a camel or a caravanserai. Paper, invented in China, made writing materials affordable across Eurasia, enabling the spread of literacy and bureaucracy. Gunpowder, also Chinese in origin, revolutionized warfare and eventually helped bring down the very walls that had protected Silk Road cities. The compass made oceanic navigation practical, enabling the maritime routes that would eventually supplant overland trade. These technologies did not simply move from one place to another. They were adapted, improved, and combined with local knowledge to produce innovations that neither origin nor destination could have created alone. The Silk Roads had woven the world together in ways that could not be unwoven, creating connections and dependencies that would persist long after the caravan stopped running. The crops that fed populations had often traveled these routes: wheat moving eastward, rice moving westward, fruits and vegetables spreading in both directions. The artistic traditions that shaped visual culture bore traces of Silk Road exchange. Chinese ceramics influenced Persian pottery. Persian motifs appeared in Chinese textiles. Greek sculptural traditions shaped Buddhist art across Central Asia. Language itself carried the marks of exchange, with words borrowed from distant tongues embedded in the vocabularies of peoples who had never met their original speakers. The Silk Roads, as historians now conceive them, were especially active from about the 2nd century BCE to the mid-15th century CE, a span of roughly 1700 years. This is longer than the entire history of many nations, longer than the time separating us from the fall of Rome, longer than the history of Christianity as a state religion in any land. For 17 centuries, goods and ideas moved along these routes, carried by countless individuals whose names were never recorded, whose journeys were never described in books or chronicles. The merchants who traded silk and spices, the monks who carried scriptures across mountains, the craftsmen who brought their skills to new cities, the pilgrims who sought blessing at distant shrines. All of them were part of a system that connected civilizations and shaped the world. We know the names of a few extraordinary individuals. Zhang Qian, who first brought detailed reports of Central Asia to the Chinese court. Xuanzang, the Buddhist pilgrim, whose journey to India inspired centuries of literature. Marco Polo, whose account captured European imagination. But for every name we know, there were millions whose contributions remain anonymous. The camel handlers and guards, the cooks and translators, the craftsmen and farmers who made the system work. The Silk Roads were not the achievement of emperors and explorers. Though emperors and explorers played their parts, they were the collective achievement of ordinary people, making ordinary decisions about trade and travel, creating through their accumulated choices a network that changed the world. What they created was something that might be called early globalization, though the term can obscure as much as it reveals. The Silk Roads did not create a single global culture or economy. The distances were too great, the exchanges too slow, the diversity too profound for that. A Chinese merchant in Chang'an and an Italian merchant in Venice lived in profoundly different worlds, with different languages, different religions, different assumptions about how society should be organized. They might never have met. If they had, they might not have understood each other. The silk that connected them passed through many hands, its journey invisible to both its producer and its consumer. But the Silk Roads did establish patterns of connection that would later intensify. They proved that goods and ideas could travel across continents, that peoples separated by thousands of miles could learn from each other, that the world was not a collection of isolated societies, but a web of relationships that linked even the most distant corners. The diseases that traveled these routes, plague, smallpox, influenza, demonstrated the same connectivity in grimmer form, spreading along the networks of exchange to devastate populations that had no immunity. Connection was never simply beneficial. It carried risks as well as rewards, costs as well as profits. The maritime routes that replaced the overland roads built on these foundations, extending and accelerating patterns of exchange that the Silk Roads had pioneered. The ships that crossed the Indian Ocean in the 16th century followed routes that Arab and Chinese sailors had used for centuries. The merchants who traded in spices and textiles built on relationships and institutions that had developed over a millennium of overland exchange. The very idea that distant markets could be connected, that goods produced in one continent could be consumed in another, that the world was a single system of exchange rather than a collection of separate regions. This idea was a Silk Road inheritance, passed down to the maritime age that followed. The routes themselves remain traceable today, though often in fragments and echoes. Modern highways follow paths that caravans wore into the landscape centuries ago, not because planners consulted ancient maps, but because geography still dictates where travel is possible. The passes through the mountains, the gaps in the ridges, the corridors between desert and swamp. These have not changed, and modern roads follow them as ancient caravans did. Cities that grew at crossroads and oases still occupy their ancient sites, their markets serving communities that have traded in the same locations for generations. Kashgar's Sunday Bazaar draws traders from across the region, as it has done for centuries. Samarkand's Registan still stands as a monument to the city's historic importance. Field boundaries and irrigation channels preserve the outlines of agricultural systems developed to support travelers and their animals. The Karis of Turfan, the underground channels that carry water from mountain snowmelt to desert oases, still function after centuries of use. The orchards and vineyards that fed caravans still produce, though now their fruits may travel by truck rather than camel. The Silk Roads are not merely history, they are embedded in the landscape, visible to those who know how to look. Modern initiatives have sought to revive and celebrate this heritage. Archaeologists excavate caravanserais and map ancient routes, using satellite imagery to detect traces invisible from the ground. Museums display the goods that traveled these paths and tell the stories of the people who carried them. UNESCO has designated multiple Silk Road sites as World Heritage Properties, recognizing their importance to human history and their value for preservation. Development projects invoke the Silk Roads as symbols of connectivity and cooperation, seeking to rebuild trade links that colonial boundaries and Cold War divisions disrupted. China's Belt and Road Initiative explicitly evokes Silk Road imagery, though its relationship to the historical roots is more rhetorical than geographical. The name itself has become a brand, attached to everything from railway projects to tourist itineraries, a shorthand for the idea of transcontinental connection and exchange. This modern appropriation sometimes obscures the historical reality, the slowness, the difficulty, the many hands through which goods passed, in favor of a romantic vision of ancient globalization. But the interest itself testifies to the enduring power of the Silk Road idea, the notion that the world has been connected for far longer than we sometimes remember, that exchange and encounter have been constants of human experience. But the true legacy of the Silk Roads lies not in monuments or development projects, but in the world they helped create. The religions practiced by billions of people today spread along these routes. Buddhism, carried by monks and merchants from India through Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan, shapes the spiritual lives of hundreds of millions. Islam, spread by traders whose faith traveled with their goods, unites over 1 billion believers from Morocco to Indonesia. Christianity, in its eastern forms, established communities along the Silk Roads that persisted for centuries, influencing cultures far from the Mediterranean world, where the faith began. The languages spoken across Asia carry words borrowed from neighbors met in trading cities centuries ago. Persian words appear in Chinese. Sanskrit terms shape Central Asian vocabularies. Arabic expressions entered languages from Spain to the Philippines. The foods eaten from Spain to Japan include ingredients that cross deserts and mountains to reach new markets. Noodles, whose origins scholars still debate. Spices that transformed cuisines, fruits and vegetables that now seem native but were once exotic imports. Tea, which became central to Chinese, Japanese, British and Russian cultures alike, was spread partly through Silk Road networks before oceanic trade took over its distribution. The Silk Roads are not something that happened in the past. They are something that continues to shape the present, a foundation on which later structures were built, a pattern of connection that subsequent centuries extended but did not erase. We live in a world the Silk Roads helped create, even if we have forgotten the slow, patient journeys that wove it together. As we reach the end of our journey along these ancient paths, the routes begin to merge in memory. The desert tracks and mountain passes, the oasis towns and caravanserais, all blending into a single image of movement across landscapes vast and varied. The merchants and monks, the craftsmen and pilgrims, the guards and guides who peopled these routes fade into the quiet distance, their individual stories lost in the larger story of connection that they collectively created. We have traveled far tonight, from the looms of China to the markets of Rome, from the heights of the Pamirs to the shores of the Mediterranean, following threads of silk and strands of thought across a world that was being woven together long before anyone gave that process a name. The Silk Roads teach us something about patience, about the virtue of slow movement, of journeys measured in seasons rather than hours, of exchanges that built trust over generations rather than transactions completed in moments. The merchants who succeeded on these routes were not adventurers seeking thrills. They were practical people who understood that lasting connections required repeated visits, shared meals, accumulated favors and obligations. A merchant might make the same journey year after year, decade after decade, building relationships with partners and suppliers and customers that would eventually pass to his sons and grandsons. The trust that made long-distance trade possible was not established overnight. It was the work of lifetimes, of families, of communities that learned to rely on each other across distances that might never be bridged by personal acquaintance. The knowledge that spread along these paths did not travel in bursts of revelation, but in the steady work of translation and teaching, of masters passing on what they knew to students who would carry it forward. A Buddhist text might take decades to translate properly, as scholars wrestled with concepts that had no easy equivalents in the target language, debated the best renderings, revised, and refined their work over years of patient effort. A craft technique might spread from master to apprentice over generations, each transmission adding small improvements or adaptations, the accumulated wisdom of centuries embedded in practices that no single person had invented. Everything about the Silk Roads moved slowly, and perhaps that slowness was part of their strength, the patience that allowed relationships to deepen and understanding to grow. Modern exchange happens at the speed of light, transactions completed in milliseconds, goods delivered in days. The Silk Roads remind us that connection has not always required speed, that the deepest exchanges may take time, that the world was woven together not by sudden revolutions, but by the accumulated weight of countless small actions over centuries of patient effort. Rest now. Let your mind drift like a camel train crossing the desert at dusk, the day's heat fading into the coolness of evening, the last light gilding the sand. The journeys we have taken tonight are ending, but the paths remain, worn into the landscape by centuries of footsteps, traceable still in the roads and cities that followed. You have traveled far, from Chang'an to Samarkand, from Dunhuang to Merv, across deserts and mountains that still bear the marks of ancient passage. Now the caravan rests, the animals are watered and fed, and the night settles softly over the camp. Imagine yourself now in a caravanserai courtyard, the stars bright overhead, the walls dark against the darker sky. Somewhere nearby, a camel shifts in its stall. Somewhere distant, a nightbird calls. The conversations of the evening have faded. The last fires burn to embers, and the travelers have found their rest in rooms around the courtyard's edge. Tomorrow will bring another day's journey, another stretch of road to cover, but that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight, there is only stillness, only the quiet settling of dust and the slow wheel of stars above the ancient walls. The roads that brought you here have been traveled for centuries. The paths that will lead you onward have been worn smooth by countless feet and hooves, marked by cairns and wells that guided travelers before you and will guide travelers after. You are part of a long caravan, a chain of journeys stretching back into the past and forward into the future, each traveler adding their own footsteps to the countless footsteps that came before. There is comfort in this continuity, in knowing that the road has been traveled, that others have rested where you rest, that the morning will come and the journey will continue. But for now, rest. Let the weariness of the day settle into the ground beneath you. Let your breathing slow to match the slow rhythm of the desert night. The Silk Roads are patient. They have waited centuries for travelers, and they will wait for you. The merchants and monks, the pilgrims and scholars who once walked these paths have long since completed their journeys, but the paths remain quiet and enduring, ready to carry whoever comes next. Let yourself become part of that quietness, that endurance. Let yourself drift like sand in a gentle wind, like starlight falling on ancient stone. If you're still awake, you'll shortly find another midnight exploration waiting on your screen. Or you may choose a playlist to continue your journey through the night. If these stories have brought you peace, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your midnight reflections with us. Your support helps our community grow and allows us to reach other fellow explorers wishing to find their rest. The roads remain even when unused. The connections they created persist in languages and religions, in foods and customs, in the very shape of the world we inhabit. And the spirit of patient exchange they embodied, the willingness to travel far, to learn new words, to trust strangers met along the way, remains as well, a reminder that the world has been connected longer than we sometimes remember, that human beings have always sought what lies beyond the horizon. Sleep now, fellow traveler, and carry that spirit with you into your dreams. The caravan rests, the stars turn slowly, the ancient roads stretch away into the darkness, waiting for morning, waiting for movement, waiting with the patience of centuries. Good night.